It was back in 2011 that Nebraska Cornhusker superfan, 6-year-old Jack Hoffman, was diagnosed with a brain tumor, a cancerous brain tumor. And it was going to be a really long road ahead for him, involving surgery and lots of treatment. And the University of Nebraska caught wind of Jack's story. And, well, you can kind of see here, hopefully, you can see what happened.
He's wearing the number 22, guys. It is Jack Hoffman of Team Jack coming out on the field right now in this 4th down and short.
For the red team,
Jack Hoffman, who's been adopted really by this football team, a young man who has battled brain cancer, is on the field right now for the Huskers.
One more snap for Taylor Martinez, too, who will hand it off to Jack.
Taylor Martinez really quarterback.
So Taylor gets the shotgun set, gives it to Jack. Here he goes. He's got blockers out in front.
There he
Jack
goes.
is running the midfield. Listen to this crowd as Jack Hoffman, a young man that, as I mentioned, has really been adopted by this football team, just scored a touchdown.
Oh, wow. What a moment.
And both benches empty.
That was a moment right there. Wow, goosebumps.
I love that moment where none of the players, none of those college athletes saw the spotlight and said, man, I'm about to go viral. I'm going to lay a hit on this kid, right? I think I can get this ball and bring it back to the house, right? No, everyone was blocking for him. Everyone was making a way for him. Everyone was cheering him on. They were all for him. And there were tens of thousands. I love being able to hear the crowd just cheering him on. And it's this moment of self-giving, sacrificial love. I don't know about you, but it like almost makes me teary seeing that. And I think it's because deep in our DNA, God has written that kind of love into us. That there's something about that we know is good and true. And I think that's what Christmas is also about. That self-giving, sacrificial, other-centered love. When it comes to God, we can't really on our own know much about him. We have 5 senses and we have our own wisdom and that's about it. The only way that we can really understand or know about God is if he reveals himself to us through revelation. And we can know a little bit about him when we examine like the stars and we can see a bit of his size and his scope and his power and the galaxies and the nebulas and all that stuff. And when we look at things like cellular biology, we can come to understand a little bit of his intelligence and the brilliance that he's woven into creation. But in order for us to know anything specific, we need him to reveal that to us, to communicate it to us. And that's what's happened at Christmas. Is that God shows up and he puts on skin. He becomes flesh in order to talk to us, in order to communicate and reveal to us who he is, who we are, what the problem in life is, and also what the solution is, that he's communicating that to us. He puts on flesh and revealing it. And last week we saw one thing that God has revealed to us at Christmas in his incarnation, that's putting on flesh, is a title, a name, which is Emmanuel. That's part of who he is and his character. And a little pop quiz here. Chris will be interested to know. Pop quiz. Emmanuel means God with us. God with us. We see that God shows up. He puts on skin. He becomes human. He enters into our reality. He understands our temptation and our struggle. He understands betrayal. He understands trauma and family and also therefore trauma, right? He understands us and he's with us. The other thing that I see at Christmas is I think about what this revelation of Jesus showing up means is another Old Testament title from Emmanuel to Jehovah Jireh. Here it is in Hebrew. In Hebrew, you read from right to left, so it feels like it's backwards. And in Hebrew, these words are Yahweh Yireh. And in English, we add some vowels to make that easier and less awkward. And in English, that is translated as Jehovah Jireh. Yahweh Yireh becomes Jehovah Jireh, which means God will see to it. God's got it. Or God will provide. So what we see coming through, and particularly, we see it first and foremost in this Old Testament story of Abraham. So if we rewind the clock a little bit, a few thousand years ago, to the story of Abraham. Abraham and Sarah were elderly. They weren't just old, like my kids think I'm old. They were elderly, right? And they were barren without children. And for them, that was a tragedy. In that day and age, there was no Social Security, there were no hospitals or hospices. It meant in your old age, in your frailty, your kids looked after you. And if you didn't have kids to do that, it actually meant it was a tragic end usually to your life. Not only that, it meant their legacy. They didn't have a legacy to continue on after them. And you think about all their families and their friends and their neighbors all had giant families. And here it was, just Abraham and Sarah on their own, alone. Desperate. The trial of their lives has been their inability to have kids. And then God shows up one day and he talks to Abraham and he says, Abraham, out of your lineage, I'm going to fill the earth. I'm going to create a nation. And Abraham says, I can't even fill a room with my family, God. I don't know if you're paying attention here. But that doesn't stop God. And sure enough, Sarah becomes pregnant in her late years. And they're so excited. The whole thing is so ridiculous. I mean, Abraham is so old. Abraham is so old that he and his baby boy had matching diapers. And the whole thing is so ridiculous that they literally name him like laugh out loud. They name their son Isaac, which means laughter. And you got to think the joy in this home. Just the ridiculousness of look at what God did. And about 10 years later, Isaac's probably 11 or 12, God speaks to Abraham again. This is what he says. After these things, God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham, and he said, here I am. He said, take your son, your only son Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I shall tell you. Think about that. His beloved son, the hope of his lineage, the hope of his life, the joy of his life. And God says, Abraham, you're going to take Isaac, you're going to slaughter your son and burn him on the altar. Imagine that conversation with Sarah, by the way. I can't imagine that being the highlight of Abraham's life. And I sense a sense, man, Abraham just must be so broken, but maybe he's not all that surprised. Because in this day and age, there was kind of a common philosophy or theology of distheism, which meant that they believed the gods were angry, petulant, malevolent, that you had to appease their anger to prevent plague and famine and disease. And so Abraham, I think, first and foremost, is just really disappointed. He thought, I thought this God that blessed me with this son, I thought he was different. I thought this God was different. And so out of fear, out of obedience, out of responsibility, Abraham is willing to go through with this, but it's got to absolutely tear him up. He's got to be bitter and angry and frustrated to hear this command of God that he thought was so different than this. In fact, in his time, child sacrifice, human sacrifice probably wasn't all that uncommon. So Abraham rose early in the morning and saddled his donkey and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac. And he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the 3rd day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. And then Abraham said to his young men, stay here with the donkey. I and the boy will go over there and worship and come again to you. And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac, his son. And he took in his hand the fire and the knife, so they went both of them together. And Isaac said to his father, Abraham, my father. And he said, here I am, my son. He said, behold the fire and the wood, but where's the lamb for a burnt offering? Abraham said, God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went both of them together. Now here we have God will provide. That word God, though, is more of a generic term for divinity. God meaning, there it's Elohim, Elohim Yireh. It's this distant, impersonal, the divine one will provide a sacrifice. Perhaps Abraham at this moment still thinks Yeah, he provided a sacrifice with this miraculous son. Elohim Yireh, the divine one, I guess, is going to provide the offering. And when they came to the place of which God had told him, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. You picture that moment where there's a wooden altar. Abraham has tied his beloved son Isaac to the wood, and the knife is raised. And I think Abraham is just absolutely broken. Abraham is furious. He's devastated. I think he's probably weeping in this process. This is his beloved son. And I think Isaac is probably crying out, Dad, what are you doing? Daddy, what are you doing? Dad, I think you've got, I think something's wrong here. This moment of just torture and pain and agony for both of them. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, Abraham, Abraham. And he said, here I am. He said, do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, from me. At the last moment, the angel cries out and says, stop! You passed the test, Abraham. And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead of his son. So we see the provision of God in this ram that just so happened to be caught up in the thicket, the provision of God to substitute the ram in the place of the son. So Abraham called the name of that place, the Lord will provide. Yahweh Yireh. Jehovah Jireh. God provides. God sees to it. And it is said to this day, on the mount of the Lord it shall be provided. Interesting little subnote here, footnote, is that Mount Moriah, was renamed Jehovah Jireh, Yahweh Yireh. The Lord will provide, because the place of that sacrifice. It was later the exact spot that King Solomon decided to build the temple. The Old Testament temple was built on this site on Mount Moriah. So, what does any of this crazy story have to do with Christmas? Well, a few thousand years later, we celebrate at Christmas the birth of God's one and only beloved Son. The Son of the promise. The Son of the promise. And 30 years into Jesus' life, the wood for the sacrifice would be loaded on Jesus' back. Remember Isaac? There's this little line. This is the wood was laid upon Isaac for the sacrifice. He carried it up the mountain. Jesus, God's beloved, one and only Son, the Son of the promise, was strapped to the wood for his sacrifice, the cross. He was condemned in the temple, which, again, Mount Moriah, that exact same spot. And Jesus carried the wood for his sacrifice to the place of Golgotha, where at that last moment, the nail, not the knife, the nail was about to descend on God's beloved Son. In that moment, God did not stop and provide a substitute. Jesus is our substitute. God did not spare his son as he did with Abraham. Instead, Jesus was slain as the true and better Isaac, as the true and better offering to provide for our deepest needs. Our deepest needs are not in our bank accounts or in our plans for next month or in our retirement savings or in our health. Our deepest needs is a spiritual need of sin. It's this curse that we are enslaved to, as we talked about a few weeks ago. Our deepest need is this curse that is in us of sin that separates us from God and that separates us from eternity with Him, that separates us from the author of life and goodness. Our deepest need is this sin within us, and Jesus is slain in our place as that substitute to provide for our deepest need, for our real true need, to set us free from our sin. And so we see at Christmas is that God's Son is born into the flesh to become for us what is needed to provide for us. Yahweh Yireh, Jehovah Jireh, God provides. At this amazing sacrifice, Jesus himself is slain in our place to take the weight of our sin, the great provision of God, who is Jehovah Jireh. And Paul talks about this exact verse here in Romans 8:31. He says, "What then shall we say to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how much will he not also with him graciously give us all things?" Here's the great truth that I see in Christmas, is that God is for us. And this idea of sparing his son, he's talking about Abraham and Isaac, that God spared Abraham and Isaac, but he did not spare his own son. Instead, Jesus was slaughtered in order to provide for us. And if God is willing to do that for us, if God is willing to send Jesus to the cross for you in order to cleanse us from our sin, how much more, therefore, is God willing to give us life in order to provide for our needs daily? If God was willing to do that for me and for you, how much more, therefore, is he willing to meet us in the needs we have today, in the moment? Jesus says in John 10:10, "I have come that you might have life and have it to the full." Again, I'll say it before, I've said it before, I'll say it again, that Jesus didn't come to bring us religion. He came to bring us life, to provide for us, to lead us into life. But that doesn't mean like some, petulant, spoiled kid at Christmas, right? It doesn't mean that we get whatever we want when we want it, right? As a parent, you know that what your kids want is not always what's best for them. And I know that there comes like some magical age where we all of a sudden think we're not stupid kids anymore, and now my desires and my impulses are all correct because I'm an adult. But God actually sees it not quite like that. And sometimes he knows what we need is not what we want, but what we need is perhaps for him to say no, and for him perhaps to bring discipline or pain in order to bring perseverance, to build our character. And so we trust that when God says he's going to lead us into life, it doesn't mean he gives us everything we want at a moment's notice, but we trust that he is, as it says here, actually for us. That if God is for us, who can be against us? I love what Peter writes here in 1 Peter 5. Peter, who walked with Jesus for a few years, says, "Humble yourselves, therefore, under the mighty hand of God, so at the proper time he may exalt you, casting all your anxieties on him." He doesn't say that you will never have anxieties if you love Jesus. He doesn't say you're never going to have stress or struggle. Peter was crucified upside down, right? There were some moments in his life that were a little stressful. But he says to cast those anxieties on Jesus, because why? Because he cares for you. The God of the stars, the God of biology, this morning as you sit here, he cares for you. That God is for you. There's a verse in Zephaniah that I think shares God's heart here. "The Lord your God is in your midst, a mighty one who will save. He will rejoice over you with gladness. He will quiet you by his love. He will exult over you with loud singing." It's his heart for us. This image, I get it. It kind of reminds me of Jack Hoffman running in that stadium as the players all just sort of surround him and lift him up and cheer, and everyone in the stadium is just screaming for him. God is excited. God is rejoicing. God is singing over you and me. There's a joy in his heart like the joy of a father over a child. And he's loudly singing over us. And when we have that understanding of God, if he's for us, then who can be against us? There's a story, I didn't ask permission to share it, so I won't share names, but I met with someone this week, and they're fairly new to faith, and really, I mean, there's something really cool going on in their hearts. God is doing. It's something new, and there's this call in their life. They feel it to want to follow Jesus, but they're afraid. She's afraid, like, how do I trust where Jesus might lead me? Like, what if that's a difficult place? Or like, what if he turns me into a jerk? Which I thought was just terrific. I loved it. Like, how do I know to trust him when I don't fully know him, even though I feel like I can feel him calling me to follow him? I don't know where he's going to take me. I love it. I said, here's what you do. You give him a chance. I give him a chance to show his heart for you. And so I said, here's what you should do. I said, how about just spend a little bit of time praying and then read. I said, let's read Philippians. So read through Philippians because it's all about Paul preaching about joy in the midst of trial and difficulty. She's going through some stuff. And I was like, read through Philippians and see if anything stands out, and then go and pray about it and just talk to God about what you read. And I get this text a couple hours later. It was a screenshot of a note, and I had no idea it was just a verse in Philippians. I was like, okay, yep, that verse is in Philippians. So I was like, here's what this means. But she said, no, you don't understand. She said, 2 years ago, my mom died, and I found some of her old journals. And I had no idea that she had ever even read the Bible, but she had written down some of these Bible verses. She wrote down this verse in Philippians 1. And I don't know why, but it stood out to me, and so I wrote it down as a note in my phone. And this morning as I'm praying, she prayed, God, show me something as I try and figure out who you are. She comes across in Philippians 1 this exact same verse that she wrote in a note 2 years ago from her mom's journal that she had no idea why she was writing it. And it was like this little moment where God was telling her, I'm with you and I'm for you. I have good for you if you're willing to trust me with it. That doesn't mean that every season of our life is going to feel good. In fact, many of you know Vlad and Daria. Vlad has been leading worship in our Roseville campus. This morning, right now, they're at the hospital with their daughter, Layla. She had a CT scan this morning. They don't really know what's wrong. It's an ear infection that won't clear up, and so I encourage you to please be holding them up in prayer. But they haven't slept in almost 2 weeks because she's up in pain all night. And I can tell you, when I sat with them yesterday, it's not a great feeling season they're in. It kind of feels like they're in the fog a little bit. But if we truly trust that God is for us, even in the midst of the fog, even in the midst of the difficulty, even in the midst of the trials, if that truly God is for us, then even in those trying seasons, we can have peace. That's the Advent candle here this morning. The week in Advent is peace. And our peace comes not from a lack of waves and turbulence around us. It's not dependent on our circumstances. Our peace comes from our reliance, our trust that God is with us and that God is for us. And if God is for us, then who can be against us? And how much more, therefore, because God who is willing to sacrifice his son, how much more, therefore, will he give us life and life to the full if we trust him with it? And the story also, though, doesn't end there. It's not just us going, well, isn't that nice? And now I can have peace and God is for me and I can go about my way. Jesus says very clearly that we are supposed to love others as we have been loved. And there's not a responsibility to earn, but there's, I think, a responsibility to respond to that love that has for us. Because ultimately, if God is providing for my needs, if he is Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides, then I don't have to. Listen, I am not great at this, FYI. I know that God is sort of turning his face a little bit right now. I'm not great at this, okay? I'm working on it. But if God is for me and he's provider, then I don't have to worry about my own needs. God will see to it. And what I can do is go, how can I be a blessing and provide for others? and be an overflow of that. And love others with the same kind of love that I've received from God. Because being for someone is not about like, all right, you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. If I'm nice to you, then you'll be nice to me, right? Being for someone is simply wanting best for them, wanting them to succeed, wanting them to thrive, right? Think about Jack Hoffman and that team wanting him to score. Even the defense, please score on us. Please. This doesn't just mean that we need to be for the people that we like. In fact, I would say that God is challenging us. Don't play it that easy. But who can you be for that might surprise them? Maybe it's a family member that you're not so excited you get to spend some time with this season. Maybe it's a neighbor who simply gets on your nerves and they're loud and annoying. How can you be perhaps for them? And maybe this one might cut a little too heavy, but let's just throw it out there. What about a coworker? Maybe even a coworker that you currently feel is trying to climb the ladder up above you. If God will provide for you, how can you be for them? To champion them. Not what can I get from you, but what can I give to you? Maybe a generous act, an encouraging word to simply spur them on. Because if God is for us, who can be against us? And so my challenge for you in this season is pray about one person. Just ask for one person. Who's one person that I can cheer for, that I can be for as a response and a reflection of what God has done in my life as he is for me. Because if God is for you, who can be against you? Let's pray. God, we can't even begin to put words to the gratitude that we need to feel that you did not spare your one and only Son, but that, God, you let Jesus stand there as a substitution for our sin, to provide for our deepest needs, to wash us clean of our sin. And God, we thank you that that is your heart, that you are for us. God, that you rejoice and sing over us. That, God, you want life and abundance according to your ways for each of us. Because you care for us. And God, I pray that that truth this morning would bring us, even in the midst of chaos, even for Vlad and Daria this morning in the hospital, that would bring peace. And God, may we be people who reflect that to the world around us, and that we champion it and be for others around us. In Jesus' mighty name we pray. Amen. Let's sing.